In the early hours of the morning when he heard footsteps in the back of the mansion, Thales Seraphim never imagined that he would find, among ancient vases and a cutting wind, the daughter he believed had been dead for over a decade. Isleen, dirty, mute, and obsessed with a map, would awaken memories that he had spent years trying to bury, including the fire that destroyed his family. But before I tell you this story, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Continuing. Wind howled through the empty corridors of the Hammond estate, rattling the windows of the sprawling mansion that stood isolated among carefully manicured gardens that hadn't seen visitors in years. Thaddeus Hammond, once celebrated as one of Massachusetts's most successful real estate developers, lay awake in his king-sized bed, staring at the shadows dancing across his ceiling. Sleep had become an elusive companion since Caroline's disappearance 3 years ago. The digital clock on his nightstand showed 2:17 a.m. when a distinct crack echoed from somewhere behind the house. Thaddeus's heart jumped in his chest, his body instantly alert. In the 15 years he'd owned this property, he'd learned to distinguish between the usual settling noises of the old house and something out of place. This sound definitely belonged to the latter category. His first thought went to the collection of rare paintings in his study or the vintage cars in his garage. The estate's isolation, once a selling point, now seemed like an invitation for thieves. Running his fingers through his graying hair, Thaddeus reached for the flashlight he kept in his bedside drawer. The metal felt cold against his palm as he swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his bare feet meeting the chilled hardwood floor. The darkness seemed thicker than usual as he made his way down the grand staircase, his hand trailing along the polished banister. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by an inexplicable dread that had nothing to do with potential burglars. The beam of his flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing nothing but the familiar expensive furniture and artwork that had long ceased to bring him any joy. As he approached the back veranda, another sound caught his attention, softer this time, almost like a whimper. Thaddeus's grip tightened on the flashlight as he reached for the French doors leading to the back porch. The security system showed no breaches, but his hands still trembled as he turned the handle. The sight that greeted him stopped him dead in his tracks. Between two large Greek urns that Caroline had insisted on buying during their last trip to Europe, huddled a small figure that made his breath catch in his throat. A child, a little girl, was curled up against the cold marble of the veranda. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, her dark hair matted and tangled, her clothes damp and dirty. Her small body was wrapped in what looked like an old blanket, spotted with mud and who knew what else. "Dear God," Thaddeus whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The girl's head snapped up at the sound, and he found himself staring into a pair of haunting brown eyes that seemed both terrified and determined at the same time. "Who are you? How did you get here?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady despite the shock coursing through his system. The security gates were supposedly impenetrable, the grounds monitored by cameras at every angle. The child just stared at him, her small hands clutching the filthy blanket tighter around her shoulders. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, rough as if she hadn't used it in days. "I need to find the place in the map," she said, the words coming out with a slight tremor. "What map? What are you talking about?" Thaddeus asked, taking a step closer. The girl flinched, but didn't try to run. Under the beam of his flashlight, he could see scrapes on her knees and a small cut above her right eyebrow. "The map," she repeated, more insistent this time. "I have to find it." Thaddeus ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble of his unshaven chin. The rational part of his brain told him to call the police or child services immediately. This was clearly a case for the authorities, a runaway perhaps, or worse. But something about the girl's presence, about the way she looked at him with those intense eyes, made him hesitate. "What's your name?" he asked, softening his tone. She studied him for a long moment before answering. "Isabella." The name came out carefully as if she was testing it on her tongue. The wind picked up, causing Isabella to shiver visibly, despite all his instincts screaming at him to maintain his distance, to call the proper authorities and let them handle this situation. Thaddeus found himself taking off his robe and stepping forward to wrap it around her tiny shoulders. "Come inside," he heard himself say. "We'll figure this out in the morning." As he led her through the door, Thaddeus couldn't shake the feeling that by allowing this child into his home, he was opening a door that could never truly be closed again. The empty halls of his mansion seemed to watch their every move as they made their way to the kitchen, where the bright fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Isabella's gaunt face. She sat at his Marble Island counter like a wild animal ready to bolt, her eyes darting between the exits while he heated some milk on the stove. The kitchen, with its professional-grade appliances and spotless surfaces, hadn't seen this much use since Caroline left. The sound of milk warming in the pan echoed oddly in the space, a domestic noise that felt out of place in his carefully maintained solitude. What Thaddeus couldn't know, was that this strange midnight encounter would be the first thread in unraveling a mystery that had haunted his dreams for years, one that would force him to confront the painful secrets he'd buried beneath layers of wealth and isolation. Morning arrived with a pale winter sun that did little to warm the frigid Massachusetts air. Thaddeus sat in his study, phone in hand, staring at the number for Child Protective Services that his secretary had sent him. He'd been sitting there for nearly an hour, watching Isabella through the doorway as she sat cross-legged on his imported Persian rug, drawing with a set of old crayons she'd found in a forgotten drawer. The night before, after 3 attempts to get her to explain how she'd gotten onto his property, he'd given up and shown her to one of the guest rooms. She'd stood in the doorway of the massive bedroom, looking impossibly small against the king-sized bed and floor-to-ceiling windows, before crawling onto a chair in the corner instead. When he checked on her an hour later, she was still there, wide awake, staring out at the dark gardens below. Now, in the harsh light of day, Thaddeus could see the details he'd missed in the darkness. Her clothes, though dirty, were of good quality, not the sort you'd find on a typical runaway. Her mannerisms, too, spoke of some kind of training. She sat with her back straight, held the crayons properly, and hadn't touched anything without implicit permission. "I should call them," he muttered to himself, thumb hovering over the phone's screen. But something kept him from making the call. Maybe it was the way Isabella had looked at him over the bowl of cereal he'd managed to find in his barren pantry. Or perhaps it was the strange familiarity of her movements as she navigated his huge kitchen with unexpected confidence. The sound of crayon against paper stopped suddenly, drawing his attention. Isabella was holding up her drawing, studying it with an intensity that seemed out of place on her young face. From where he sat, Thaddeus could make out the rough shapes of a house, a crooked tree, and what appeared to be a dog without ears. His coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Isabella didn't flinch at the sound, too absorbed in her artwork, but Thaddeus barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the drawing, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew that house, knew that tree, knew that dog. It was impossible. There was no way she could have seen that place. The old Thompson property had been demolished years ago, long before this child was even born. But there it was, sketched in waxy colors, the exact view from his childhood bedroom window down to the peculiar bend in the oak tree where lightning had struck it when he was 9. The dog, his dog Max, had lost both ears to frostbite one particularly brutal winter, yet had lived another happy decade despite his odd appearance. "Isabella," he called out, his voice rougher than he intended. "Where did you see this place?" She looked up at him, those dark eyes seeming to peer straight through his carefully constructed walls. "In the map," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "What map?" he pressed, walking over to kneel beside her. "Please, you need to tell me where you saw this." Instead of answering, Isabella reached for another crayon, a broken blue one, and began adding something to the corner of the paper. Thaddeus watched transfixed as she drew a small pond behind the house. His throat tightened. That pond had been his sanctuary as a child, the place he'd retreat to when his father's temper became too much to bear. "Stop," he whispered, but Isabella kept drawing, adding details that no one but him should have known. The tire swing that hung from the oak's strongest branch, the crooked chimney that never drew smoke quite right, the broken step on the back porch that everyone learned to skip. "How do you know these things?" he demanded, grabbing her small shoulder. She jerked away from his touch, the blue crayon snapping in her grip. For a moment, they stared at each other, the wealthy businessman and the mysterious child, while the grandfather clock in the hall marked the heavy seconds between them. A knock at the front door made them both jump. Thaddeus straightened up, adjusting his wrinkled shirt as he strode to answer it. On his doorstep stood Martha Chen, his housekeeper of 15 years, her eyes widening as she took in his disheveled appearance. "Mr. Hammond, are you all right?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "I've been trying to reach you all morning. You missed your 9 o'clock with the board." Thaddeus blinked, suddenly aware that he had no idea what time it was. He glanced at his watch, 11:47 a.m. 4 missed calls and 7 unread messages blinked accusingly on his phone's screen. "I'm fine, Martha, I just..." He trailed off as Isabella appeared silently behind him, her drawing clutched to her chest. Martha's gasp was audible. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "She looks just like..." "Martha," Thaddeus cut her off sharply. "Would you mind making us some lunch? I believe the kitchen needs restocking as well." Martha's eyes darted between Thaddeus and Isabella, questions burning in her gaze, but years of professional discretion won out. "Of course, Mr. Hammond. I'll take care of it right away." As Martha hurried toward the kitchen, Thaddeus could feel the carefully ordered structure of his life beginning to crack. The drawing in Isabella's hands seemed to mock him, dredging up memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. But it was Martha's unfinished sentence that truly terrified him, because he knew exactly who Isabella looked like, and that was impossible, wasn't it? The next few days passed in a blur of unanswered questions and mounting unease. Every attempt to contact Child Protective Services ended in endless hold music or disconnected calls. The local police department's missing persons database showed no reports matching Isabella's description. It was as if she had materialized out of thin air, bringing with her an increasingly unsettling collection of knowledge that she shouldn't have possessed. Martha had taken charge of caring for Isabella's immediate needs, returning from her shopping trip with clothes, toiletries, and other necessities. The child accepted everything with the same quiet intensity she'd shown since her arrival, but Thaddeus noticed how her eyes lingered on certain objects around the house: his mother's antique music box, the faded photograph of his childhood home that he'd hidden away in his study, the old brass key he kept in his desk drawer. It was on the 4th night that the screaming started. Thaddeus bolted awake to the sound of terror echoing through his hallways. He found Isabella thrashing in her sleep on the chair she still refused to leave, her small body tangled in the blanket Martha had given her. Without thinking, he reached out to wake her, only to have her grab his arm with surprising strength. "The fire," she gasped, her eyes flying open but seeing something far away. "The fire is coming, and Mommy won't wake up." Thaddeus felt the blood drain from his face. "What did you say?" But Isabella had already curled back into herself, trembling and muttering words he couldn't quite catch. He spent the rest of the night in the armchair across from her, watching as she drifted in and out of fitful sleep, his mind racing with possibilities he didn't dare voice. The next morning, while Isabella picked at the pancakes Martha had made, Thaddeus retreated to his study and pulled out a key he hadn't used in years. The bottom drawer of his desk opened with a protesting creak, revealing a stack of newspapers he'd never been able to bring himself to throw away. The headline from 15 years ago still had the power to make his hands shake: "Tragic fire claims young mother and child." Below it, a photograph of himself, younger, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that cost more than most people made in a month, standing outside the charred remains of what had been his first home with Rebecca. Rebecca, his first wife. The woman who had taken their 2-year-old daughter and disappeared into the night, only to allegedly perish in a house fire 3 states away. They'd never found their bodies in the wreckage, but the evidence had been conclusive, or so the investigators had said. Rebecca's car in the garage, their daughter's favorite stuffed animal in the ruins, dental records that supposedly confirmed the worst. A soft sound made him look up. Isabella stood in the doorway, her new dress already wrinkled, holding another drawing. This one showed a woman with long dark hair sleeping on what looked like a couch, while orange flames crept up the walls behind her. "Who is this?" Thaddeus asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The sleeping lady," Isabella replied, her focus entirely on the drawing. "She wouldn't wake up when the bad men came." "What bad men?" Thaddeus pressed, but Isabella had already turned away, wandering back to her corner of the living room where dozens of similar drawings now littered the floor. Martha found him there hours later, surrounded by old newspapers and photographs, his face ashen. "Mr. Hammond," she ventured carefully, "there's something you should see." She held out a small ribbon, frayed and faded to a pale blue. "I found this in the pocket of her old clothes while doing laundry." She turned it over, revealing 3 letters embroidered in delicate silver thread, LYS. Thaddeus stared at the ribbon, his right hand unconsciously moving to touch his upper arm where, hidden beneath his expensive shirt, those same letters were tattooed in an identical font, the initials of the daughter he'd lost, the name he'd had etched into his skin on the day they'd told him she was gone. "Lily," he breathed, the name feeling foreign on his tongue after so many years of forced silence. Her name was Lily. Martha nodded slowly, her eyes filled with tears she wouldn't let fall. "There's more," she said, pulling something else from her pocket, a small, worn photograph. It showed a younger version of the same woman from Isabella's, drawing fast asleep on a familiar couch. The timestamp in the corner read just 2 months ago. "Where did you get this?" Thaddeus demanded, snatching the photo from Martha's trembling hands. "It was folded inside the ribbon," she replied. "Mr. Hammond, I think you need to consider the possibility that—" "No," he cut her off sharply. "It's impossible. Lily died in that fire. Rebecca died in that fire. I spent years looking for answers, hired the best investigators money could buy. They're gone." But even as he said the words, his eyes drifted to the doorway where Isabella stood, watching him with those hauntingly familiar eyes. Rebecca's eyes. The same eyes that had looked up at him from countless photographs over the years, the ones he'd finally packed away because he couldn't bear their accusatory stare. "Sir," Martha said gently, "look at her birthmark." Thaddeus's head snapped. Up. "What birthmark?" Martha moved toward Isabella, kneeling beside her with the practiced ease of someone used to dealing with children. "Sweetheart, may I see your ankle, the one with the special mark?" Isabella didn't respond verbally but lifted the hem of her dress slightly, revealing her right ankle. There, just above the bone, was a small, distinctive mark in the shape of a crescent moon. Thaddeus felt the room spin around him. He grabbed the edge of his desk for support, his knuckles turning white from the force of his grip. Lily had been born with that exact same birthmark. The doctors had called it unusual, a perfect crescent moon, dark against her pale skin. It had been one of the identifying features listed in the missing persons report he'd filed when Rebecca first disappeared with their daughter. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, more to himself than to Martha or Isabella. The fire, the investigation, everything pointed to— His voice trailed off as a memory surfaced, Rebecca's last words to him the night she left. "You'll never understand what it means to love someone more than your own ambitions." He'd dismissed them as the bitter accusations of a failing marriage, but now they took on a different weight. Isabella had wandered back to her drawings, seemingly oblivious to the adult's distress. She picked up a red crayon and began sketching what looked like flames around the sleeping woman's figure. The casual way she drew the fire made Thaddeus's skin crawl. "Martha," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "I need you to do something for me. Find out everything you can about where Isabella's been staying. Talk to people in the neighborhood. Check local shelters, anything. Someone must have seen her before she showed up here." Martha nodded, already reaching for her phone. "What about the photo? Should we try to trace where it was taken?" Before Thaddeus could answer, Isabella spoke up, her voice clear and steady. "The sleeping lady never wakes up anymore. She just lies there, even when people come to take pictures." Millionaire, hair on the back of Thaddeus's neck stood up. Isabella, do you know where this sleeping lady is? She shook her head, adding more flames to her drawing. The bad men took her away in a big white car. They said she was sick and needed special medicine, but they lied. They always lie. Martha and Thaddeus exchanged alarmed looks. When was this, sweetheart? Martha asked carefully. Before I found the map, Isabella replied, as if that explained everything. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. When she smoothed it out on the floor, Thaddeus felt his heart stop. It wasn't a map at all. It was a torn page from a magazine featuring his estate in a Homes of New England spread from 3 years ago. The article had run shortly after Caroline left, when he tried to drown his loneliness in publicity and social events. But someone had drawn on the page, marking a crude path from the city to his front, gates with a child's handwriting scrawling "safe place" across the top. Who gave this to you? He asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. Isabella's crayon stilled. The nice nurse. She said I had to find you before they came back. She said, you'd know what to do because... She hesitated, her small face scrunching up in concentration. Because you have the same letters on your arm that I have on my ribbon. Thaddeus sank to his knees beside her, rolling up his sleeve with trembling fingers to reveal the tattoo he'd kept hidden for 15 years. Isabella reached out, her tiny fingers tracing the letters that matched her ribbon exactly. L-Y-S, she read slowly. Lily Yvette Seraphin. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Thaddeus stared at the child before him. This mysterious girl who knew things she couldn't possibly know, who carried his daughter's birthmark and name, who had appeared on his doorstep like a ghost. From his past. Martha's phone buzzed, making them all jump. She glanced at the screen, her face paling. Mr. Hammond, you need to see this. Someone just sent me an anonymous email with Rebecca's medical records from last month. Martha's hands shook as she held out her phone, displaying medical records from St. Catherine's Hospital in Connecticut. The patient's name jumped off the screen. Rebecca Marie Seraphin. The admission date was just 6 weeks ago, and the diagnosis made Thaddeus's blood run cold. Stage 4 glioblastoma terminal. There's more, Martha said softly, scrolling through the documents. Notes from her social worker indicate she was trying to make arrangements for... She glanced at Isabella, who had returned to her drawing, seemingly oblivious to the adult's conversation. Thaddeus took the phone, his eyes scanning the text rapidly. According to the notes, Rebecca had been admitted to the hospital's palliative care unit after collapsing at a small apartment in Hartford. She had no emergency contacts listed, no family members to notify. The social worker's reports painted a heartbreaking picture of a woman racing against time, desperately trying to set something right before it was too late. She knew she was dying, Thaddeus whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She knew, and she tried to... His voice trailed off as he reached the final page, a handwritten letter scanned and attached to the file. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably Rebecca's. To whom it may concern, I know my time is running out. The doctors say I have weeks, maybe days. I've spent 15 years running from my mistakes, and now I can't run anymore. What I did was unforgivable. I took a child from her father, faked our deaths, and lived in the shadows because I convinced myself it was the right thing to do. I thought Thaddeus loved his empire more than his family. I was wrong, so terribly wrong, but by the time I realized my mistake, it was too late to turn back. Lily, Isabella now, doesn't remember her early years. The trauma of our constant moving, the fear I instilled in her, it all took its toll. 3 foster homes failed because I kept interfering, kept checking on her from a distance, my guilt and love warring with each other. When she ran away from the last home, I couldn't find her for months. By the time I did, the cancer had already spread. I'm leaving this record in hopes that someone will help her find her way back to her father. She carries a blue ribbon with her initials, the same initials Thaddeus had tattooed on his arm the day we disappeared. She has his mother's music box hidden under her bed at the shelter. She draws the old house obsessively, though she doesn't know why. These aren't coincidences. They're breadcrumbs I've been leaving, hoping they'll lead her home. Thaddeus, if you ever read this, I'm sorry. I was young, scared, and foolish. I convinced myself you were as cold as your father. that you'd turn our daughter into someone as haunted by ambition as you were, but I see now that my actions caused more damage than anything I feared you might do. Please, if you find her, help her remember. Help her heal. Love her the way I should have let you love her all along. Rebecca. The phone slipped from Thaddeus's grasp, clattering to the floor. Isabella looked up at the sound, her dark eyes, Rebecca's eyes, meeting his with an intensity that made his chest ache. "The sleeping lady wrote that," she said matter-of-factly, returning to her drawing. "She cried a lot while she was writing. Her hands kept shaking, and the nurse had to help her hold the pen." Martha picked up her phone, wiping tears from her cheeks. "She was there," she whispered. "Isabella was there when Rebecca wrote this." Thaddeus felt his legs give way and he sank into the nearest chair. The magnitude of what he was discovering threatened to overwhelm him. 15 years of believing his family had died in a fire, 15 years of building walls around his heart, of turning into exactly the kind of man Rebecca had feared he would become. "The music box," he said suddenly, turning to Isabella. "You have your grandmother's music box?" Isabella nodded, reaching into the small backpack she'd kept close since her arrival. From it, she pulled out a tarnished silver box that Thaddeus hadn't seen in over a decade. His mother's prized possession, the one thing Rebecca had taken when she fled, not for its monetary value, but because it had been the only thing that could soothe their colicky baby to sleep. "It doesn't play anymore," Isabella said, a note of sadness in her voice. The sleeping lady tried to fix it, but she couldn't make the dancer spin. Thaddeus took the box with trembling hands. He knew every scratch on its surface, every dent in its corners. But there, on the bottom, was something new, a series of numbers scratched into the silver, fresh enough that they hadn't tarnished yet. Martha leaned in to look. "Those look like coordinates," she said, already typing them into her phone. When the map loaded, she gasped. "Mr. Hammond, it's pointing to a storage facility in Hartford, less than a mile from St. Catherine's Hospital." Isabella had stopped drawing again, her attention fixed on the music box. "That's where the sleeping lady kept all the pictures," she said. "She said they were for when I was ready to remember." Thaddeus stared at the child before him. His daughter, he was becoming increasingly certain, and felt the weight of 15 years of loss and loneliness pressing down on him. But mixed with the pain was something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. "Martha," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "make arrangements for us to go to Hartford tomorrow." As Martha hurried from the room, already making calls, Thaddeus noticed Isabella adding one final detail to her drawing: a small figure holding what looked like a silver box, standing in front of the house with the crooked tree. For the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled. The drive to Hartford felt like traversing through a dream. Thaddeus sat in the back of his Mercedes beside Isabella, who hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the estate. Martha drove, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at the unlikely pair, the successful businessman in his tailored suit and the small girl who might be his long-lost daughter, both lost in their own thoughts. The storage facility was a weathered building on the outskirts of town, its faded blue paint peeling in the winter wind. Unit 247. The numbers matched those scratched into the bottom of the music box. Thaddeus's hands trembled as he inputted the combination: 527, Lily's birthday. The door rolled up with a grinding sound that made Isabella flinch. Inside, stacked neatly against the walls, were dozens of plastic storage containers. Each was labeled meticulously in Rebecca's careful handwriting: Lily, age 3, Lily, age 4, and so on, all the way up to Lily, age 17. "She planned for everything," Martha whispered, running her fingers over the labels. "She kept a record of every year you missed." Thaddeus felt his throat constrict as he opened the nearest box. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, documenting moments he should have been part of. Isabella's first day of school, her missing front teeth, her skinned knees from learning to ride a bike, birthday parties in small apartments, Christmas mornings in motel rooms, summer days in public parks. Each photo told the story of a life lived in shadows, always looking over their shoulders. But it was the small notebook at the bottom of the box that made his hand shake. Opening it, he recognized Rebecca's handwriting immediately. My dearest, Lily, I know by now you're probably confused and scared. The doctors say my time is running short and there's so much I need to tell you. First, about your name. Isabella was never meant to be permanent. It was just another hiding place like all the others we've used over the years. Your real name, the one your father gave you, is Lily Yvette Seraphin. Your father. Oh, Lily. How do I even begin to explain? The man I ran from 15 years ago wasn't the monster I made him out to be in my mind. I was young, terrified of losing you to his world of wealth and power. I convinced myself he would turn you into someone cold and distant, like his own father had done to him. But I was wrong. The hardest truth is that while I was running from the father I feared you'd have, I became the mother I never wanted to. There's someone who stole your chance at a stable life, who made you live in fear of strangers, who couldn't give you the home you deserved. In the bottom of this box, you'll find every letter your father wrote to the police, to private investigators, to newspapers. He never stopped looking for us, never stopped loving you. The tattoo on his arm, your initials, was his way of keeping you close when I took you far away. I'm leaving these records, these photographs, these memories, hoping they'll help you understand both my mistakes and your father's love. The truth is, Lily, you were never unloved. You were loved so much that we both made terrible choices. He by burying himself in work to numb the pain of losing you, and I by stealing you away to protect you from a danger that existed only in my mind. The social worker promised to help. You find your way back to him. If you're reading this, I hope you're already there. I hope you're safe in the home that should have been yours all along. I love you, my darling girl. I'm sorry for every moment of happiness I stole from you and your father. Forever yours, Mom. Thaddeus looked up from the letter to find Isabella, Lily, standing before a larger box, one marked simply evidence. Inside were newspaper clippings, missing person posters, and private investigator reports. Every effort he'd made to find them, carefully preserved by the woman who'd hidden from him. I remember some of this, Isabella said softly, touching. A photograph of herself at age 4, sitting on a park swing. The sleeping lady, Mom, she would take pictures every day, said they were for someone special who missed me, but I couldn't remember who. Martha, who had been quietly sorting, through another box suddenly gasped. She held up a stack of unopened envelopes, all addressed to Lily Seraphin in Thaddeus's handwriting. She kept them all, Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. Every birthday card, every Christmas letter, she never sent them back. Never. Threw them away. Isabella reached for one of the envelopes, her small fingers tracing the address. Can we read them? Thaddeus nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Together, they sat on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit, surrounded by boxes filled with 15 years of lost moments, and began to open the letters he'd written to a daughter he thought he'd never see again. The first envelope contained a card with a pink balloon on the front. Inside, in handwriting that shook with grief, were the words, "Happy 3rd birthday, my precious Lily. Wherever you are, I hope you're safe. I hope you're loved. I hope someday you'll know how much I've missed you, love, Daddy." Isabella's hand found his as they read, her small fingers intertwining with his larger ones. Neither of them spoke about the tears that fell onto the aging paper. The sun was setting by the time they finished reading the last letter. Each envelope had contained a piece of Thaddeus's heart, poured out in words that had never reached their intended recipient. Birthday wishes, Christmas hopes, simple updates about his life, all sent into the void, hoping somehow they would find their way to his daughter. Martha had excused herself hours ago, saying she would check them into a nearby hotel, leaving father and daughter alone with their shared history. The storage unit had grown cold as evening approached, but neither seemed to notice, too absorbed in piecing together their fractured past. "There's something else," Isabella said suddenly, reaching into her small backpack. She pulled out a worn, leather journal, its pages swollen with use. "Mom wrote in this every night at the hospital. She said I should give it to you when I found you, but only after you read the letters first." Thaddeus accepted the journal with trembling hands. Opening it to the first page, he found himself staring at a detailed account of every day since Lily's disappearance. Rebecca had documented everything, their constant moves, the series of aliases, the close calls when his private investigators had almost found them. But more than that, she had recorded every milestone, every laugh, every tear, every moment he had missed. October 15th, 2012, he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. Lily lost her first tooth today. She was so proud, showing it to everyone. At the shelter, I caught her practicing her smile in the bathroom mirror, that sweet gap-toothed grin that reminds me so much of Thaddeus. I almost called him today, almost told him where we were. But then I remembered his father's words at our wedding. A Seraphim man's first loyalty is to the family legacy. I couldn't let her become another asset in the Seraphim empire. But God, how she looks like him when she smiles. Isabella. Lily moved closer, leaning against his arm as he turned the pages. Each entry revealed another piece of their stolen history, another moment that should have been shared rather than secreted away in this cold storage unit. December 25th, 2016. Another entry read, Lily asked about her father today. Not the usual questions about where he is or why we left, but about who he is as a person. Does he like chocolate ice cream? Is he afraid of thunderstorms? Does he sing in the shower? I told her the truth, that her father loves mint, chocolate chip, that he used to hold me during storms, that he has a beautiful voice but only sings when he thinks no one can hear. She smiled and said she likes mint chocolate chip too. The guilt is eating me alive. The journal went on, year after year, painting a picture of a mother slowly drowning in regret, watching her daughter grow up without the father who desperately searched for her. The later entries became harder to read, not just because of Rebecca's deteriorating handwriting, but because of the raw pain that bled through every word. March 3rd, 2024, one of the final entries read, The headaches are getting worse. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do. I've spent 15 years running from my mistakes and now time has run out. Lily deserves to know the truth, to know her father, to have the life I stole from her. I've arranged everything, the storage unit, the clues, the map that will lead. Her home. I pray it's enough. I pray he can forgive me. I pray she can understand why her mother was such a coward. I remember that day, Isabella said softly, touching the tear-stained page. She cried all night. The nurses tried to give her medicine to help her sleep, but she said she had to finish writing. She said she owed you her words since she stole so many years. Thaddeus closed the journal, unable to read more through his blurred vision. In his mind's eye, he saw Rebecca as she had been, young, fierce, determined to protect their daughter from imagined threats. The tragedy was that in trying to save Lily from becoming a victim of the Seraphim wealth, she had made them both victims of her fear. Dad? Isabella's voice was small, uncertain. It was the first time she had called him that, and the word hung in the air between them like a fragile bridge across 15 years of absence. Yes, he managed to respond, his heart thundering in his chest. Can we go see Mom? The nurses said she was moved to a special place where sleeping people go. I think she'd want to know I found you. The request hit him like a physical blow. Rebecca was in hospice care, dying alone while their daughter wandered the streets, looking for a father she couldn't quite remember. Whatever anger he had harbored all these years melted away, replaced by a profound sadness for all they had lost. Yes, he said, pulling his daughter, his Lily, close. Yes, we can go see her. But first, there's something I need you to... No? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a silver locket, identical to the one in the photograph where 3-year-old Lily sat on his shoulders, laughing at something beyond the camera's view. I bought this the day you were born, he said, opening the locket to reveal a tiny picture of himself holding a newborn wrapped in pink. I've carried it every day since you disappeared, hoping somehow someday I'd be able to give it to you. Isabella took the locket with reverent care, her small fingers tracing the engraved initials on its surface, LYS. St. Catherine's Hospice was a low, peaceful building surrounded by winter bare gardens. Martha had insisted on coming with them, hovering protectively nearby as Thaddeus and Isabella followed a soft-spoken nurse down hushed corridors. The air smelled of antiseptic and sadness, a combination that made Isabella grip her father's hand tighter. Room 215 was at the end of the hall, its door partially open. Through the gap, they could see medical equipment casting a soft rhythmic glow over a still figure in the bed. The nurse, her name tag read Sarah, touched Thaddeus's arm gently. "She's been unresponsive for the past week," Sarah explained, in low tones. "But the doctors say hearing is often the last sense to go if you'd like to speak to her." Thaddeus nodded, unable to form words. Isabella had already slipped into the room, drawn to the bed where her mother lay. Rebecca's once vibrant face was gaunt, her dark hair streaked with grey and spread across the white pillow like spilled ink. But even in this diminished state, Thaddeus could see the woman he had loved, the mother who had gone to desperate lengths to protect their child from imagined dangers. "Mom." Isabella's voice was barely a whisper as she approached the bed. "I did it. I found him. I found Dad." The only response was the steady beeping of monitors and the soft whoosh of oxygen. Isabella climbed carefully onto the chair beside the bed, reaching for her mother's thin hand. "Look," she continued, holding up the silver locket. "He kept it all this time, just like you kept all the letters. And the music box. We found everything in the storage room. All the pictures, all the memories you saved." Thaddeus moved to stand behind his daughter, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. The gesture felt both foreign and achingly familiar, like a long-forgotten melody suddenly remembered. "Rebecca," he said, his voice rough, with emotion. "I'm here, we're both here." For a moment he thought he saw a flicker of movement beneath her closed eyelids, but it might have been just a trick of the light. The woman in the bed remained still, her breathing shallow and measured. "The nurses told me she asked for you," Sarah said quietly from the doorway. In her lucid moments, she would talk about a man who had a silver locket and their daughter's initials tattooed on his arm. "She was so afraid you wouldn't find each other before." The nurse's voice trailed off, but the unspoken words hung heavy, in the air. Rebecca was dying, slipping away even as they stood there, finally reunited as the family they should have been all along. Isabella pulled something from her pocket, one of her drawings. This one showed 3 figures standing together, a tall man in a suit, a small girl with dark hair, and a woman who seemed to glow with a soft light. "I made this for you, Mum," she said, carefully tucking the paper under her mother's limp hand. "See, we're all together now. You don't have to be scared anymore." Thaddeus felt tears sliding down his cheeks, but he made no move to wipe them away. He thought of all the anger he'd carried, all the bitter words he'd rehearsed if he ever found Rebecca. None of them mattered now. What mattered was the small girl who had somehow found her way back to him, and the woman who, despite her mistakes, had loved their daughter enough to ensure she would find her way home. "I forgive you," he whispered, the words falling like weights from his shoulders. "I understand now, I understand everything." A single tear rolled down Rebecca's cheek, catching the dim light like a diamond. Whether she had heard him or not, Thaddeus would never know for certain. But in that moment, something shifted in the room, a tension uncoiling, a peace settling, over them like a soft blanket. Isabella leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her mother's forehead. "Thank you for keeping all the memories safe," she whispered. "Dad and I will keep them now. You can rest." They stayed there as evening deepened into night, the 3 of them together for the first time in 15 years. Martha brought them coffee and sandwiches, which went largely untouched. The nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting medications, speaking in hushed tones about comfort and peace. Around midnight, Rebecca's breathing changed, became softer, more irregular. Isabella had fallen asleep in the chair, her head resting against her father's arm. Thaddeus watched as the woman he had once loved, the mother of his child, took her final breaths. In the end, Rebecca slipped away quietly, with their daughter's drawing still clutched in her hand and their forgiveness filling the room like a benediction. The drive back to the estate was silent, heavy with the weight of endings and beginnings. Isabella slept in the back seat, exhausted from the emotional toll of the past few days, while Martha navigated through the pre-dawn darkness. Thaddeus sat beside his daughter, the journal and letters from the storage unit carefully packed in a box at his feet. His mind wandered back to the small private ceremony they'd arranged at Rebecca's request, simple, dignified, attended only by the three of them and a handful of caring hospice staff. Isabella had insisted on bringing fresh flowers, choosing white lilies that seemed to glow in the winter sunlight. She'd placed her mother's favorite drawing among the blooms, the one of their family together, whole and happy as they should have been. The sun was just beginning to paint the horizon in pale gold when they turned onto the long driveway leading to Hammond Estate. Isabella stirred, blinking sleepily at the familiar gates that had seemed so imposing just a week ago. "Are we home?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. Home. The word echoed in Thaddeus's heart. This massive house had been many things. Over the years, a symbol of his success, a fortress against loneliness, a gilded cage of his own making. But it had never truly been a home, not since that terrible night 15 years ago when his family had been torn apart. "Yes," he answered, softly, "we're home." Martha pulled up to the front entrance and quickly went ahead to open the house, leaving father and daughter alone in the car for a moment. Isabella sat up straighter, studying the imposing facade with new eyes. "It looks different now," she said thoughtfully. "Less scary." Thaddeus understood what she meant. The house itself hadn't changed, but something fundamental had shifted in the way they saw it. The shadows that had haunted its halls seemed less dark, the emptiness less overwhelming. As they walked inside, Isabella stopped suddenly in the foyer, her attention caught by something on the wall, a photograph Thaddeus had almost forgotten about. It showed a much younger version of himself, standing in front of the old Thompson property, the crooked oak tree visible in the background. "That's the house from my drawings," she said, her eyes wide with recognition. "The one with the tree and the pond. It's real." Thaddeus knelt beside her, touching the frame gently. "Yes, it's real. It's where I grew up, where I lived until I was 18. The house isn't there anymore, but the land still is. I never sold it." Isabella turned to him, a familiar determination in her eyes. Rebecca's determination, but softened by something that was uniquely her own. "Can we go see it?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't visited the old property in years, avoiding the memories it held. But looking at his daughter's hopeful face, he realized that perhaps it was time to stop running from the past. "Yes," he said, "but first, there's something else we need to do." He led her to his study, to the antique desk where he'd spent so many lonely hours building his empire. From the bottom drawer, he pulled out a dusty photo album he hadn't opened since the day Rebecca left. "These are pictures from when you were a baby," he explained, opening to the first page. Before everything happened." Together they sat on the leather sofa, the album spread across their laps. Each photograph told a story: Isabella's first smile, her first steps, the way she used to fall asleep on his chest while he worked late into the night. There were pictures of Rebecca too, young and beautiful, looking at their daughter with such love it made his chest ache. "Mom kept pictures too," Isabella said, reaching for her backpack. She pulled out a handful of worn photographs, carefully preserved despite years of moving from place to place. "She said I should always know what you looked like, even if I couldn't remember." Thaddeus looked at the photos his daughter offered, newspaper clippings of his business successes, blurry shots taken from a distance at charity events, even a few surveillance photos that must have cost Rebecca dearly to obtain. Each one was dated and labeled in her neat handwriting. Your father at the children's hospital opening, Dad receiving the Business Leader Award, Daddy looking sad on your 10th birthday. The last one hit him hard. He remembered that day, clearly, standing alone at Lily's empty grave, placing a small cake beside the headstone that bore no body. The photograph captured his grief perfectly, the way his shoulders hunched against the weight of loss, the flowers in his hand drooping, like his hopes. She was there, he realized aloud. Rebecca was watching. Isabella nodded, pulling out one final photograph. It showed Rebecca standing at a distance, her face tear-stained, watching him mourn at the empty grave. On the back, she had written, "The day I almost came home." Mom said she went to all my birthday memorials, Isabella said quietly. She said it was her punishment, watching you grieve for us when we weren't really gone. She said it was the closest thing to hell she could imagine. Thaddeus pulled his daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, a mixture of Martha's fancy shampoo and something uniquely her own. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully feel the magnitude of what they had all lost. Rebecca's fear-driven sacrifice, his own grief-stricken withdrawal, and their daughter caught between two broken parents who loved her too much in all the wrong ways. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet discoveries and gentle adjustments. Martha had transformed one of the guest rooms into a proper bedroom for Isabella, filling it with soft colors and comfortable furnishings. The child still preferred to sleep in the chair by the window, but each night she moved a little closer to the bed, like a wild creature slowly learning to trust its new home. Thaddeus found himself moving through his daily routine in a daze, attending video conferences with his board of directors, while his eyes constantly drifted to the drawing pad where his daughter sat, sketching her memories into existence. The house itself seemed to breathe differently, as if awakening from a long, cold sleep. It was on a particularly cold morning that Isabella brought him the last piece of the puzzle. She appeared in his study doorway, clutching something wrapped in tissue paper. "I found this in Mom's things," she said, carefully placing the package on his desk. "She said I should give it to you when I was ready to remember everything." Thaddeus unwrapped the tissue paper with trembling fingers. Inside was a small USB drive, labeled simply "The Truth" in Rebecca's handwriting. He plugged it into his laptop, and Rebecca's face filled the screen, gaunt and tired, but with a fierce determination in her eyes. "Thaddeus," she began, her voice scratchy but clear, "if you're watching this, then our daughter has found her way back to you. There's so much I need to explain, so many wrongs I need to right. But first, you need to know why I ran that night." Isabella climbed onto his lap, her small body fitting perfectly against his chest as they watched Rebecca's confession unfold. The video had been recorded in her hospital room, just weeks before they found her. "Your father came to see me that day," Rebecca continued on screen. "He had private investigators' reports, photographs of us together, even surveillance of our daily routines. He said a Seraphin heir couldn't be raised by someone like me, a scholarship student from the wrong side of town. He threatened to use his connections to have me declared an unfit mother, to take Lily away legally if I didn't disappear voluntarily." Thaddeus felt his chest tighten. His father had died 5 years ago, taking this secret to his grave. The knowledge that his own parent had orchestrated the destruction of his family made him feel physically ill. "I was young and terrified," Rebecca's recording continued. "Instead of coming to you, instead of trusting in our love, I ran. I convinced myself it was the only way to keep our daughter safe. But in doing so, I stole something precious from both of you. The chance to be father and daughter, to love each other, to grow together." Isabella's hand found his, squeezing gently as they watched her mother's tearful confession. "The fire was staged," Rebecca admitted. "A condemned house, carefully planted evidence, a story leaked to the press. Your father's people handled everything. He wanted you focused on the business, not searching for a family he deemed unworthy. But I kept every letter you sent, every article about you, every piece of evidence that you never stopped loving our little girl." The video continued, detailing years of moves and close calls, of Rebecca's growing regret and her desperate attempts to balance protecting their daughter with preserving memories of her father. She explained how Isabella had run away from the last foster home, how the cancer diagnosis had forced Rebecca to face her mistakes, and how she had carefully laid the breadcrumbs that would lead their daughter home. "The hardest part, Rebecca, said, her voice breaking, was watching her draw that house, your childhood home, over and over without knowing why. Some part of her remembered, Thaddeus. Some part of her never forgot you. The recording ended with Rebecca looking directly into the camera, her eyes filled with tears and determination. Love her enough for both of us now. Help her remember who she really is, not Isabella the runaway, but Lily Yvette Seraphin, daughter of a man who never stopped searching, never stopped loving, never stopped hoping she'd come home. The screen went dark, leaving father and daughter sitting in silence, both processing the weight of Rebecca's final confession. Isabella turned in his lap, her small hands framing his face with a child's directness. "I remember some things now," she said softly. "Like the way you used to sing, 'You Are My Sunshine,' when I couldn't sleep, and how you always smelled like mint and coffee, and the way you'd carry me on your shoulders so I could touch the leaves on the trees." Thaddeus felt tears sliding down his cheeks, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of grief. His daughter, his Lily, was remembering. She was finding her way back not just to his home, but to his heart. "What else do you remember?" he asked gently, afraid to push too hard, but desperate to know how much of their early time together had survived in her memory. Isabella's face scrunched up in concentration. I remember a promise. You used to say it every night before bed. Something about stars." "As many as the stars," Thaddeus whispered, the words coming back to him like a long-forgotten prayer. "I'll love you as many as the stars." Isabella's eyes lit up with recognition. "And I would say, to the moon and all the way back," they finished together. The decision to visit the old Thompson property came on a Sunday morning after Isabella had woken up in her bed for the first time since arriving. She'd been having fewer nightmares, and the ones that did come were no longer about fires and running, but about simpler things, lost toys and missed playground dates. Martha insisted on packing them a picnic lunch, though the December air was bitter cold. As they drove through the familiar streets of Thaddeus's childhood neighborhood, Isabella pressed her face against the window, comparing the real scenery to the images she'd drawn from some deep, hidden place in her memory. The old property had gone wild in the years since the house was demolished. Nature had reclaimed the land, turning it into a secret garden of winter-bare trees and frost-covered grass. But the crooked oak still stood, its twisted branches reaching toward a pearl-gray sky. "It's exactly like my drawings," Isabella breathed, stepping out of the car. She was bundled in a new wool coat that Martha had insisted on buying, her dark hair tucked under a matching hat. "But how did I know? I never saw pictures of this place." Thaddeus took her mittened hand in his as they walked toward the oak tree. "Your grandmother, my mother, used to bring you here sometimes when you were very small. She loved this place, said it had magic in it." They reached the tree, its massive trunk bearing the scars of the lightning strike that had twisted it all those years ago. Isabella reached out to touch the rough bark, her face thoughtful. "I remember a swing," she said slowly, "right here, hanging from this branch, and someone pushing me so high I thought I could touch the clouds." "That was me," Thaddeus said softly. "Every Sunday morning, rain or shine, you used to beg for just one more push until your mother called us in for lunch." They spread the picnic blanket under the old oak, sharing the sandwiches and hot chocolate Martha had packed. Isabella pulled out her ever-present sketchbook, but instead of drawing the past, she began to sketch something new, a house, modern and warm, with large windows and a wraparound porch. "Could we build it?" she asked, showing him the drawing. "Not a mansion like the estate, but a real home, right here where the old one used to be, with a tire swing in the oak tree and a garden for Martha to grow flowers." Thaddeus studied the sketch, seeing in its simple lines all the warmth and love that had been missing from his life. The estate, for all its grandeur, had never felt like more than a museum of his loneliness. But this could be something else entirely. "Yes," he said, watching his daughter's face light up. "Yes, we could build it. But what about school, your friends?" Isabella's expression grew serious. "I never had real friends before. We moved too much, and school..." She hesitated, then continued in a smaller voice. I haven't been to a real school since I ran away from the last foster home. Mom tried to teach me things when she could, and I read a lot at the library, but the admission hit Thaddeus hard. His daughter, so bright and articulate, had been denied even the basic stability of an education. But instead of anger, he felt a fierce determination. They had lost so much time, but the future was still unwritten. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "There's a good school nearby and I can work from home more often. Martha already loves you like a grandmother," and he trailed off, noticing that Isabella had gone very still, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. Following her gaze, he saw a familiar figure making its way across the frost-covered ground. Martha, carrying what looked like a large photo album. "I hope you don't mind," Martha called out as she approached, "but I found this in the attic last night and I thought it was time." She handed the album to Isabella, who opened it carefully. Inside were photographs Thaddeus had never seen, intimate family moments captured by his mother before she passed away. There was Rebecca reading to a toddling Lily in the garden. There was Thaddeus asleep in his office chair, tiny Lily curled up on his chest. And there, in the center of the album, was a photo of all three of them under this very oak tree, the tire swing visible in the background. "Your grandmother gave me this for safekeeping," Martha explained, sitting down on the blanket with them. "She said someday it would be needed to help someone remember who they really were." Isabella traced the photographs with gentle fingers, her expression a mixture of wonder and recognition. "We were happy," she said softly. "Before everything went wrong, we were really happy." "Yes," Thaddeus agreed, pulling her close. "And we can be happy again, different maybe, but still happy." They spent the rest of the afternoon under the old oak, sharing stories and memories, both lost and found. Isabella drew more pictures, not of the past this time, but of the future. A new house filled with light and laughter, a garden bursting with flowers, a family pieced back together, not perfect but whole in all the ways that mattered. As the winter sun began to set, casting long shadows across the empty lot, Isabella tucked her sketchbook away and stood up, brushing grass from her coat. She walked to the oak tree, placing her small hand against its rough bark. "Mum would like this," she said with quiet certainty. "She'd like knowing we found our way back here, back to where everything started." Thaddeus joined her at the tree, remembering all the lives that had unfolded in its shade. His own childhood, his early days with Rebecca, their brief, beautiful time as a family. Now, standing here with his daughter, he felt the circle beginning to close. "Ready to go home?" he asked, holding out his hand. Isabella smiled, taking his offered hand. "We already are home, Dad. We already are." Spring came early that year, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. The old Hammond estate had been sold, its cold grandeur replaced by the warmth of a newly built home on the Thompson property. The house, designed from Isabella's drawings and refined by architects who understood the importance of maintaining her vision, stood proud beneath the ancient oak tree. Martha's gardens were just beginning to show signs of life, tiny green shoots pushing through the soil where she had carefully planted bulbs in the fall. The tire swing, exactly like the one from their shared past, swayed gently in the morning breeze. Isabella, who now answered to both names, Isabella with friends and Lily with family, sat at her new desk by the window working on her homework. The transition to regular school had been challenging, but with tutoring and determination, she was quickly catching up to her peers. More importantly, she was making real friends for the first time in her life. Thaddeus watched her from the doorway, marveling at how much could change in just a few months. The frightened, withdrawn child who had appeared on his doorstep that winter night had blossomed into a confident, happy girl who filled their home with laughter and drawings and endless questions about everything. "Dad?" she called out, not looking up from her work. "Can you help me with something?" He moved to stand behind her chair, looking down at what she was writing. It wasn't homework at all, but a letter, carefully penned in her improving handwriting. "Dear Mom," it began. "Dad and I went to visit you yesterday and brought your favorite lilies. The stone carver finally finished your headstone, and it's beautiful. Simple and elegant, just like you always wanted. Martha planted white roses around it, and in the spring they'll bloom and make everything look like a garden. Thaddeus felt his throat tighten as he read over her shoulder. They had chosen to bury Rebecca in the small cemetery near their new home, where Isabella could visit whenever she wanted. The headstone was indeed simple, bearing only Rebecca's name, dates, and the words, "Beloved Mother, your love led us home." "I'm Mahai." "Not sure how to end it," Isabella admitted, looking up at him with questions in her eyes, Rebecca's eyes, but now filled with peace instead of fear. "Why don't you tell her about your dreams?" he suggested softly. "The good ones." Isabella smiled and turned back to her letter, writing, "I don't have nightmares about the fire anymore, Mom. Instead, I dream about the future, about graduating from school someday, about becoming an artist, about having a family of my own. Dad says you'd be proud of how far I've come. I think he's right. I understand now why you did what you did. I understand that love can make people do desperate things, and fear can make them lose their way. But love can also lead them back home. That's what you did for us in the end. You led us back to each other, back to this place where we all began. Dad and I have a new bedtime ritual now. We still say the old words, as many as the stars and to the moon and all the way back, but we've added something new. We say thank you. Thank you for keeping the memories safe. Thank you for leaving us the breadcrumbs to find our way. Back, thank you for loving us enough to let us go. Love always, your Lily, Isabella, Seraphine." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. "Can we take it to her tomorrow?" "Of course," Thaddeus said, pulling her into a hug that felt as natural now as breathing. "We can go after your art class." Isabella had started taking formal art lessons, her natural talent flourishing under proper instruction. Her teacher had been amazed by her portfolio of drawings, the house, the tree, the memories she'd captured on paper long before she understood their significance. "Dad?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Do you think we'll ever forget again? The good parts, I mean." Thaddeus looked around the room, at the photographs on the walls showing their past and present intertwined, at the silver music box now restored and playing its gentle tune, at the drawing of 3 figures that still hung above her bed. "No," he said with certainty, "we'll never forget again. Your mother made sure of that. She kept our memories safe until we were ready to hold them ourselves." Later that evening, as the sun set behind the old oak tree, father and daughter sat on their new porch swing, sharing stories and dreams and simple moments that would become memories of their own. The silver locket gleamed at Isabella's throat, catching the last rays of daylight. Inside the house, Martha hummed as she prepared dinner, the sounds and smells of home drifting through open windows. The tire swing moved gently in the evening breeze, casting shadows that danced across the garden where spring flowers were just beginning to bloom. And somewhere, in the space between memory and hope, a family that had been broken found its way to becoming whole.